Thank you for joining us here in our optimal webinar series, The Evolution of Leadership. It is a pleasure to see those again who have joined us in our previous sessions, and I do see a few familiar names. Hello again, and warm welcome for those who are joining us here for the first time. So my name is Catherine from Optimal Hong Kong, and I will be your host today. So in this presentation, as you can see from the title, we will explore the fascinating journey of human evolution and how it has laid the foundation for the leadership behaviors and dynamics that we observe today in the corporate setting. So we will look into how humans, like ourselves, have risen to become the most impactful species on the planet. Now, throughout the session, we will examine key theories and explore the roles of group dynamics, competition, and leadership emergence as well. And finally, and very importantly, we will also look at how understanding our evolutionary motives can inform modern leadership practices, enhance engagement, and improve organizational effectiveness. So, based on the latest research and a lot of discussion topics, there are quite a few areas that we will touch upon today. For example, so in what ways do innate human motives like status and affiliation impact leadership emergence and effectiveness? What traits or behaviors are linked to successful leadership and how we can develop them? And for most of us who will be interested to gather hands-on solution, practical insights on developing more effective leaders for today's complex organization as well. So by the end of our time together, I am certain that we will have a richer understanding of the deep roots of leadership to be able to walk away with practical ideas for fostering more effective or better leadership in your organization. So for today's presentation, as you can see, we are very fortunate to have Dr. Ryne Sherman, Chief Science Officer from Hogan, together with Krista as well, Anne Marie, whom you've seen from other webinars. And then from Optimal side, so there will be myself along with my other colleagues from different locations as well. So as we are going through this presentation, if you have any questions, comments about the topic, please feel free to scan. You will see a QR code later in the chat box. Okay, so we will have all those questions inside the chat box consolidated later because we will have a Q&A session at the end. Okay, so without taking too much time, without any further delay, I will pass the time to Ryan to begin.
Well, thank you, Catherine, for inviting me here. Thanks to you and to Wan Lang and the entire Optimal group for putting this webinar series together. And thank you, as always, for inviting me and Hogan to be a part of it. Really proud to partner with all of you and in each of your markets. It's always great to work with Optimal Consulting and knowing that you all are delivering the best in Hogan insights to so many of your clients around the world. So really appreciate you having us here today. As Catherine said, I'm going to be talking about the evolution of leadership, or how our evolutionary history impacts the way people lead today, and how we choose leaders and how we can develop more effective leaders in modern organizations. So this is just a bit of an overview of what I'm going to cover today. We're going to talk a little bit briefly about some human nature. We're going to talk about some theoretical perspectives on human nature as well. We're going to talk about what does it mean to work in a group and live in a group, and how does that impact what our leaders are like. And then we're ultimately going to talk about what it means to lead in today's organizations. And Catherine has generously put in plenty of time for us to have some Q&A at the end as well. And so I'll be cognizant of that to make sure we have enough time if you all have questions along the way to address those towards the end. So I want to begin with a puzzle of human existence. And so this, to me, I think is I think most people don't think about this puzzle, but to me, this is a pretty interesting puzzle. So I call this the humans are squishy point of view. So compared to other animals, we don't have sharp teeth, we don't have sharp claws, we can't fly, we're not particularly strong, We don't have a powerful bite, and we're not very fast. So, for the typical individual human, the world is an extremely dangerous place, a place where the individual human is very likely to get eaten. Um, so this creates a sort of a puzzle. If humans are so weak, not very fast, can't bite very strong, don't have sharp teeth, how is it possible that humans have become the most deadly and invasive species on Earth? And yes, I do mean deadly and invasive. And invasive. If you look at the history of killing, we're really good at it. Humans are much better at killing and controlling their environments than any other species on the planet, at least today. So the question is how? How is this possible? We don't have these sharp claws. We don't have sharp teeth. We're not very strong, not very fast. How is it possible that humans have gotten to where we have gotten on the planet? And I believe the answer lies in group living, and that is that humans live in groups. Humans coordinate their activities in a way that makes it so that we are the most powerful and most deadly and most invasive species on the earth. So, what does that mean, group living? Well, what is group living really about? And again, a lot of this draws on research by evolutionary psychologists. One of the things we know about group living, one of the things that makes humans unique, not unique compared to all creatures living today, but relatively unique, is our ability to coordinate activities via language. And, other species have some language. They have ways of communicating with each other as well, but they don't seem to be quite as effective as humans. Now, some evolutionary psychologists or biologists would say things like, well, it's about brain size and those kinds of things. And there's even entire lines of research talking about how fire was a major contribution to human adaptation and human evolution, because what fire does is it cooks food, making it easier to eat and easier to digest, which they think actually led to larger. So many animals in the animal kingdom today spend most of their time hunting for food or sleeping. That's it. You either hunt for food and you eat, or you sleep, and that's it. Those are the only activities you can do. But for humans, because they had fire, they didn't have to spend so much time digesting food, which meant they could spend less time eating because the food was already sort of pre-eaten with the fire. And this made it much easier to digest and much more likely that your brain size could grow. And those kinds of increases in brain size led to improvements in language abilities, language capabilities, and ultimately coordination of activities. We also see in humans the ability to assign roles and to divide labor. This is also true in other species. Bees do this, ants do this as well, right? But bees and ants don't have some of the other abilities that humans have. Like, we're bigger than both bees and ants, and so that has an impact as well. But this idea of having roles and division of labor is really, really essential for group living to be really effective. Or, as I tell people all the time, any great achievement in human history was always done by a group, whether that's building of a great wall or flying a spaceship to the moon. This required some groups working together. Individuals weren't capable of doing this alone. And that requires people adopting certain roles, that requires people dividing up their efforts, dividing up labor in a particular way. And it also requires some degree of leadership. We know that in every group, leaders emerge, and leaders help groups coordinate their activities, help groups divide up into roles, help groups decide who's going to do which tasks to make the group ultimately more efficient and more effective. At least that's the idea. Now, we're going to talk about ways that leaders are more or less effective at that as we go along today. But I do want to mention a little bit about that many of you may have seen when it comes to sort of core human needs. Now, this is famously Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of human needs. This is probably the most famous hierarchy of human needs. When you talk to people about human needs, many people have heard of this pyramid or this hierarchy of needs, or the needs pyramid, as some people might call it. I don't really think it makes any sense because pyramids are three-dimensional and this is two-dimensional, but okay, we'll play along. But it begins with physiological needs, right? That you need to survive: food, water, rest. And then it goes to safety needs. So these are things like protection from threats, protection from the alligator who might eat you. Um, and then it goes into these sort of social needs. These are the needs that come up when we live in a group. And I'm gonna really focus on these two needs: our belongingness and love needs, and esteem needs, or accomplishment kind of needs. These are two important ones. And I think they're really important. I mean, all of these needs are important, but they're really important in social life, which we're going to see is an important part of what we're going to talk about today. And then the last one at the very, very top is self-actualization. This need is kind of silly. Nobody knows what it is. Nobody knows how to measure it. So this is why I don't think Maslow's hierarchy of human needs is um, very relevant today. And in fact, some other researchers, these are evolutionary psychologists, have renovated Maslow's hierarchy of needs to be more consistent with what we know about evolutionary history. So these researchers suggest that there are these immediate physiological needs. And again, why the question is, why is it in this shape? The answer is that you have to meet those needs below to really focus on the needs above. If you haven't met your immediate physiological needs, right? If you have a lack of oxygen, you're not going to worry so much about your self-esteem. It's much more important to get oxygen than to get self-esteem. So that's why they're in this sort of triangular or hierarchical shape. But according to these evolutionary psychologists, you have a very similar set of needs that Maslow identified. You've got those immediate physiological needs. You have self-protection needs, and then those status, esteem, and affiliation needs. Those two in the middle. These two social needs. These two needs that only emerge when you live in groups. So non-group living animals don't really have these needs. They don't have needs for esteem. They don't have needs for affiliation. It's only group living animals that have these, which is really important for coordinating group activities, as we'll talk about. Now, the evolutionary psychologists also, I think many of them are interested in sleeping with their graduate students, and so they're really focused on mating, and so they add needs like mate retention and mate acquisition. Okay. Certainly from a biological standpoint or from a genetic standpoint, those are important things that people do. I mean, if you don't, you, if you don't live long enough to have an offspring and raise an offspring, and that's where the parenting need is at the top, then you're not here today, right? If your ancestors didn't do that, then you wouldn't be here today. So that's where this framework comes from. Now, Bob Hogan famously talked about socioanalytic theory, and socioanalytic theory combines some of what we know from evolutionary psychology, some of this work back here on our evolutionary needs, to work from sociology, which has to do with what's called symbolic interactionism, which is the notion that in social interaction, things are happening. There are objectives to social interaction. It's not just people randomly bumping into each other. When people interact socially, it is for an important reason. Something is going on there, and that's what comes to us from sociology and psychodynamics. Bob Hogan was heavily influenced by Sigmund Freud and psychodynamic theory, suggesting that our own individual psychologies and our own psychological histories actually shapes the way we think and we act as individuals today. And so the other thing that socioanalytic theory points out to us, again, drawing back on our evolutionary history, is that all people live in groups. Remember, humans are squishy. If we didn't live in groups, we wouldn't be able to survive. So it's really, really essential that we live in groups. We learn to live in groups. Our evolutionary history is all about group living. This is why it's so painful when you get excluded from the group. There's an entire body of research focused on what is known as ostracism. Ostracism meaning just being left out of the group. Why is that so painful? Well, from an evolutionary standpoint, if the group excluded you, typically our ancestors were nomadic, meaning they would pick up and go somewhere. Well, if you got left behind, being the squishy human that you are, you weren't going to survive very long. So it was really essential that you belong to the group. This is why ostracism is so painful today. We don't think about that. We don't think, geez, I'm being left out. I'm at a risk for dying. that's not the way we think about it. But your evolutionary history has created a situation where the pain centers in your brain are actually activated when we are excluded from a group. So that's why ostracism is actually quote unquote painful. It's actually the same centers in your brain that activate when you get punched or when you drop something on your foot. Those pain centers are activated when we are ostracized as well. So this is why getting along is such an important part of group living. We have to get along if we want to be part of the group. But the other thing that happens, the other part of group dynamics is that some people want to get ahead. Some people seek status or seek those esteem needs in Maslow's framework. Um, and so that's an integral part of what it means to be a group. Some people will rise to the top of the group. Uh, there are benefits and there are consequences for rising to the top of the group. Some of the benefits, again, evolutionarily speaking, historically speaking, those who rose to the top of the group often had mating preferences, whereas those who didn't have such preferences. But at the same time, those who rose to the top of the group also were under constant threat for somebody else who was jealous or wanted to. And in fact, this is where those kind of emotions come from, is from combat over these things. And we're going to talk a little bit about that sort of within group competition today as well. Finally, the final point that socioanalytic theory makes, and this is where that symbolic interactionism comes in, is that social interaction is what matters. Social interaction is where the action is. Socioanalytic theory talks to us about reputation and impact. It says that ultimately, social interaction is about shaping our reputation, understanding our reputations, and understanding the impact of our reputations on other people, what kind of impact we're having on others. So that's what socioanalytic theory really cares a lot about. It doesn't care, for instance, about what you think about yourself. That's very different from other theories of personality. Other theories of personality are very concerned about how do you think about yourself. Psychodynamic theory is very concerned about how you think about yourself and helping you cure your neuroses. Socioanalytic theory isn't so concerned about that. Socioanalytic theory is concerned about the impact you're having on others and the reputation you earn. Socioanalytic theory also has a very important perspective on language, suggesting that much of the language activity, while it is about coordinating group efforts, it's also about sharing reputational information about others, also known as gossip. There's lots of research on gossip, but some of the strongest theory around gossip suggests that the purpose of gossip is to share reputational information so that you can better predict how someone is going to behave when you interact with it, which is really important as well. So if we're living in groups, we have to think about what are those group dynamics? What are the critical dynamics for group living species like humans? Well, there's actually two. And by the way, you can apply this to other species, not just humans. But there are two kinds of competition within human groups or among human groups. The first is that within group competition. This is about who's gaining status, who's losing status, who's keeping up with the Kardashians, and so on, right? That's what all of those are about. Are things going well? Are things going badly for me? Am I getting promoted? Am I getting demoted? Am I emerging as the leader of my political party, or am I, falling, did I lose an election and I've lost status within my party? So that's all about within group competition. The second kind of competition for groups is the between group competition. That's which group is dominating who, which group has the most resources. Bob Hogan likes to say, historically in our evolutionary history, there might be two groups, one on one side of the river and one on the other. And when this group came across the river to find you, they were coming for your stuff. And when they came for your stuff, they didn't come with their lawyers, looking to sue you and draw up papers, right? They were coming to do harm. And that leads us to this final point here, which is about the principal factor in human evolution is between group competition. Now, much of the focus in psychology is about within group competition. It's about things like ostracism. It's about who's getting left out, who's in the in-group, who's popular, who's not. Lots of research in psychology is about within group competition. Very little focuses on between group competition. But between group competition has been essential in human history for shaping who we are today, much more important than the within group competition. And of course, the principal manner of between group competition in human history is warfare. If you don't believe me, we can look to some others. So the former magistrate, historian, Jonathan Sumption, in his books, well, he wrote 5 volumes on the Hundred Years' War. This is what he said in the opening volume. At most times, war has been the principal collective enterprise of mankind. It has given human societies their identities. It has shaped their institutions and provided the ultimate test of their solidarity. This is the point here is that warfare is fundamental. This is a critical aspect of human history that is shaping who we are as humans. Now, look, the point of my talk here isn't to tell you warfare is great. So I hope you don't get the wrong message here. But the point is, it is a thing that has happened for a long time. And by the way, if you look around the world, it's continuing to happen right now all the time. And it ultimately has had historically important consequences of how we've evolved as a species. We can go back just a little bit further than Sumption's work on the 100 Years' War. Here's a quote from a book. They're talking about capturing a city. They said, when you capture a city, put to the sword all the men in it, utterly destroy them, save alive nothing that breatheth. Further, it went on, as for the women and children, you may take these as plunder for yourselves. I don't know if anybody recognizes the book that this is from, but it's like I said, a little bit older than the 100 Years' War. This is from the Bible. So the point here is that between group competition, warfare has been around for a long time, and it continues to be around today. And ultimately, that between group competition matters. When we are talking about, if the group comes for you and kills you, you don't have any offspring, right? That's the end of your genetic line. So when we talk about shaping human evolution, which is all about a genetic process, having a better group meant a lot, historically speaking. Being part of a better group meant a lot, historically speaking. And here's just examples of how much leadership can matter. If you have the right leader in your group wins. Your group wins the between group competition. And by the way, this isn't just for men. There are lots of examples of women leaders in history too that have had a huge impact on their group's likelihood of survival, success, and ultimately the evolutionary history of the people who are descendants from that group. I won't do any history lessons here about these folks, but you can look them up on your own. So what do we know about leadership? We know that leadership is really, really important, right? We know that who is the leader of our group has important consequences for that essential between group competition. So what do we actually know about leaders, about being effective, or even just about leadership at all? Well, we can begin with reviewing the academic studies of leadership. Now, as I mentioned earlier, most psychological research focuses on within group competition. This is also true in the leadership literature. When we look at leadership studies, most leadership studies are about who's in charge. They focus on getting to the top of an organization. They do things like compare leaders to non-leaders. Hey, I want to study leadership. I know what I'll do. I'll look at people who are leaders, and I'll just compare them to non-leaders, or just say, hey, this is what leaders are like. Lots and lots of studies like that. In fact, thousands of studies have been done like that. And because there's so many studies that have been done like that, this was a quantitative summary, what's known as a meta-analysis of all of the studies that had been done in that fashion. This was done in 2002. So this is already a 23-year-old study, and this study had thousands of studies in it. And what did they find? They found that the big 5 personality traits, 4 of the big 5 personality traits, predicted who shows up as a leader. So we know that personality is related to becoming a leader. Ultimately, they did some fancy statistics, and they showed that personality accounts, well, the multiple correlation is 0.53. What does that actually mean in practical terms? That means if you are low on neuroticism, high on extroversion, high on openness, and high on conscientiousness, you are about 3 times more likely to emerge as a leader than someone who is the opposite of those. So we know personality predicts who is much more likely to lead. This is also true in Hogan data. So if you're familiar with Hogan's assessments, this is our HPI data. This is a look at our global executives, several thousand. Actually, in this case, there's 114,000 people in this particular sample. Leaders from all over the world. We see that ambition stands out. These are norm scores from 0 to 100. So we can see that a 62 when the global population is at a 50. This is 12 percentage points higher on ambition. Ambition is the #1 predictor of becoming an executive worldwide, followed somewhat closely by learning approach, which is about your interest in learning and growing your knowledge. So we know personality distinguishes between people who are likely to emerge as leaders. And as I mentioned earlier, there is lots of studies on leadership emergence. Academics love to study leadership emergence. It's their favorite thing to study, partly because it's very easy. Let me just go get a sample of leaders and compare them to everyone else. Just as another example of this, there's been some recent research in the academic world about different kinds of leadership emergence. In particular, there's a focus on 2 different kinds of leaders, those who lead via dominance versus those who lead via prestige, whereas dominance is about gaining power via rank and intimidation, whereas prestige is more about gaining power or social rank by expressing your knowledge or skills and your expertise, trying to earn respect. Well, okay, what does this research tell us? Well, it's not very surprising that prestige is overwhelmingly preferred by followers. So followers prefer leaders who try to gain status via prestige versus those who try to gain status via dominance. That's probably not too surprising. But ultimately, I think this entire line of research misses the point. This research focuses all on what it takes to lead, to emerge as a leader, but it misses anything about being effective. There's no information. We know that followers prefer those who use the prestige route, but are they any better? Are they any more effective? There's no evidence to suggest that either of these 2 strategies are actually more effective at leading. So most research focuses on who's in charge. And ultimately, what we know about getting in charge of organizations is that, well, organizations today are pretty unique. Today's organizations are big, they're hierarchical, they tend to be bureaucratic. It's mostly males dominating those organizations. So the question is, what does it take to get to the top of one of those organizations? And that is people who can emerge, right? So this is what all this research in academia is about. It is about having the right personality characteristics to win that within group competition for status. Can I get to the top of the organization? That's one question, and most of the studies in the academic literature have focused on this. But almost no studies, including the one I just talked about dominance and prestige, have actually focused on winning the between group competition. We refer to this at Hogan as leadership effectiveness. So everything else is about leadership emergence. The within group competition is about emerging as a leader. The between group competition is about beating the other team, beating the other group. And unfortunately, there's very little to say about leadership effectiveness. So who is a good leader? What do we actually know? Again, we can review the academic literature. And as I mentioned, there's not a lot of consensus there about who a good leader is. The academic literature is full of ideas about leadership. It talks about all different kinds of leadership. Transformational leader, you've probably heard of these. Transformational, authentic, situational, path goal, charismatic, LMX. These are all different. There's a whole bunch of others, probably hundreds of different types of leadership that you can find if you review the academic literature of leadership. And all of these say that this is one way to be effective as a leader, but none of these actually have really strong evidence to support them as, and in fact, many of these styles of leadership have an opposite style that says do exactly the opposite of what that style says, right? So like for example, transformational versus transactional. There's different kinds of leadership that have different oppositional styles. And there's no evidence that one is actually better than the other. So instead, what it is these are styles that leaders employ, but nobody really knows, are these actually the most effective way to lead? So, with this in mind, Bob and Joyce Hogan, about 25 years ago, said, there's really no consensus around what good leadership is like. So maybe we should look at the opposite. Maybe we should understand if there's any consistency around bad or ineffective leadership. And with that in mind, they went scouring the literature to go find out, what do we actually know about the opposite of good leadership? What do we know about ineffective leadership, bad leadership? Well, they found out several things. One of the things they found out was that about two-thirds of managers were failing. And I'm going to talk about some of the evidence for that. And that comes from several pieces of research, some research by Fred Herzberg, some research by John Bentz, some research by the Center for Creative Leadership, and then our own research that we've done using the Hogan Development Survey. So starting first with Fred Herzberg. So Fred Herzberg wrote an article in Harvard Business Review. And the article was about the two-factor theory of motivation. And Herzberg's article argued that workers or employees were driven by two motivational factors. One was these sort of pull factors, these things that would make you like the organization, these things that would motivate you to be an effective employee. And the other side was these sort of push factors, these things would push you away from being a good employee, these things that would alienate you. And the idea was that leaders could engage in either of these kinds of things. These different behaviors that leaders engaged in either were pulling their employees towards being more productive or pushing them away from being more productive. It was the most requested article in the Harvard Business Review for about a 20-year period. And while the sort of first set of factors is kind of interesting, most of that was about the idea of self-actualization. It was about individuals wanting to feel intrinsically motivated by their work, just loving their work because it was their life's calling. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of great research that shows that work. People will tell you anecdotally all the time, the classic phrases. If you love what you do, you'll never work a day in your life. There are some people that, for them, that is true. But for the overwhelming majority of the workforce, that just isn't a reality, right? So we really didn't pay too much attention to his first factor. But the second factor in Herzberg's work, what he called hygiene factors, these were things that managers and leaders were doing that alienated their staff, that created disengagement, that led to loss of productivity and loss of employee satisfaction. The other thing that Herzberg noted was that about two-thirds of employees were alienated, were unmotivated to be at work, which, as far as we could tell, he was the first person to note this. A second line of research on ineffective leadership comes from John Bentz. John Bentz was the director of research at Sears, which was a big box store kind of company selling all kinds of appliances and clothing and just about anything you wanted to buy. You could buy at Sears furniture for a really long time. And he was the director of research there for 30 years. They had stores all over the United States and in several other places around the globe. He noted that about two-thirds of the managers they hired at Sears failed to manage their stores effectively, had to be replaced. And because he was a really meticulous researcher, he kept track of all of the reasons that they failed. Then he noted a couple of things. Number one, they were all really smart. They all had really high IQ test scores. Number two, they all seemed to do really well on an interview. But ultimately, they had some underlying personality issue that led to them being dismissed. And he actually identified 11 categories, 11 reasons that these leaders failed and had to be dismissed. Finally, the third piece of evidence around ineffective leadership comes from the Center for Creative Leadership. They basically replicated what Bentz found, except they did it on a much larger scale. They did it with leaders of corporations. They did it with executives. They found that about two-thirds of executives were failing and had to be fired and replaced within 5 years. they found that it was mostly due to some underlying personality issue. They were all really smart. They all had high IQ scores. They all did really well on interviews. They had great experiences and backgrounds, but ultimately, two-thirds of them failed as leaders. And they classified the reasons that they failed, and it pretty much closely aligned with the 11 categories that Benz had found. So this leads us to the last piece of evidence, which is research done by the Hogans using the Hogan Development Survey. Now, the Hogan Development Survey, or the HDS, measures the dark side of personality. This is an assessment that tries to pick up on these blind spots or potential things that you do that you might think are strengths in your daily life. But when we overuse those, or when we become stressed, or mostly when we stop managing our impression, these derailers ultimately can lead to career failure. And organizations all over the world use the HDS to identify these potential risks for derailers and their managers. There are 11 scales on the HDS. That's intentional. John Benz found 11 ways that leaders fail. That's what the HDS really covers, is 11 ways that leaders can go wrong. And we use the HDS to help organizations and individuals mitigate those potential derailers when they're in leadership positions. Okay, so we know a lot about the ways leaders can go wrong. We know most leaders do go wrong. We know the reasons that they go wrong are wrong or due to some underlying personality issues. And we have a really strong measurement base for identifying those potential derailers, those potential ways that leaders go wrong. So let's return back to the question of leadership effectiveness. Who is actually good at winning the between group competition? Now, obviously, on the one hand, it's about people who don't engage in ineffective leadership strategies, people who can mitigate their potential derailers. But let's go back to the question about what does it mean to win a between group competition? Well, a couple of things that we know about groups versus individuals is that at some deep level, evolutionarily speaking, the individual human mostly cares about the individual human. The individual human has, well, there's an entire book called The Selfish Gene, which is about the value, the intrinsic, inherent, built-in dynamics from your ancestors, right? That if your ancestors weren't at some fundamental level motivated to protect their genes, to engage in behaviors that led to the progenation of their genes to the next generation, then you wouldn't be here today, right? So you have a built-in mechanism for selfishness to some extent, selfishness around your genes. And what this means is that in a group context, when we're talking about a between group competition, we have to set aside our individual selfishness. And so we know that when it comes to group outcomes, if there's something that's good for the group, it's always good for the individuals in the group. So if it helps our group do better, all of the individuals, all the boats rise at the same time. But if it's good for the individual, that doesn't necessarily mean it's good for the group. And there's all kinds of research in economics around free riders and the impact of free riders on groups and those kinds of things. And that's what I mean when we talk about just because it's good for you as an individual doesn't mean it's good for the group. But almost always the case when it's good for the group, it's good for the individuals in that group. Leadership then is all about the group. So when we talk about what it means to be an effective leader, some people will ask that. Well, what is it? What do you mean by leadership effectiveness? Well, leadership effectiveness is about building and maintaining a high-performing team, building a group that can win the between group competition. So leadership in that sense is about convincing individuals to put aside their own personal goals, their own selfish agendas, for the collective good of the group. Now, when I think about that, I think that sounds an awful lot like engagement. That's what we're talking about when we talk about people who are engaged. We're talking about people who are committed to our organization, committed to the mission of our organization, committed to the values and vision we have for the future of our organization. And they're putting in that extra time. They're putting in that extra effort because they are engaged. They have set aside their own personal wants for the group good. Ultimately, what do we know about engagement? Well, we know that engagement is the sort of G factor. If you're familiar with IQ testing, there's this factor called G, which is the sort of the idea is that it's just overriding factor that it shapes all different forms of intelligence. Well, if that's the case, we know that engagement is that central factor in organizational effectiveness. Organizations that are the most effective have engaged employees. Engagement predicts every single organizational outcome of interest. So it predicts productivity, predicts turnover, who's going to leave the job early, who's not going to show up to work. It predicts who's going to get into an accident. Um, so engagement is the key criteria to understand if a leader is being effective. If a leader is effective, the group will be engaged. And ultimately, then that means we can measure leadership effectiveness by measuring team engagement. So that leads to the next question, which is kind of obvious. All right, if leadership effectiveness is about engagement, then we have to ask ourselves, well, what creates team engagement? Well, there's quite a bit of research that shows that this is what people tend to respond best to. Followers tend to be most engaged if their leaders do the following things. The first thing is they provide what we call structure and consideration. This is some classic research done by some IO psychologists showing that people perform better, they're more engaged if they know what to expect at work on a daily basis, and if they know that somebody at work cares about them. Now, I talk a lot about structure and consideration in talks that I give. And one of the things that I point out to people, so many people in the audience have kids. I have kids, and lots of people have kids. And there's an entire field of research called developmental psychology. And there's lots of questions about developmental psychology, but some of the critical questions are around, well, how do I, raise my kid? How do I make a kid, psychologically healthy? How do I raise a kid in a way that's healthy and that they're going to be happy and have a good life? And it turns out there isn't a whole lot you can do. It turns out genetics has a really powerful impact on how we turn out as adults. But there are a couple of things that we know for sure parents can do. One is provide a predictable home environment. Kids in chaotic home environments where they get punished for one thing one day and rewarded for the same thing the next day are much more likely to have challenges, particularly psychological issues later in life. And the second thing that you can do to be a more effective parent is to love your kid. And that's pretty much it. It turns out those are really the only two things you can do: create a predictable, cohesive environment and provide love and care for your kid. After that, how they turn out is pretty much out of your control, which I think for many parents sounds hopeless, but hey, the data are what they are. The interesting thing here about this, why do I talk about this with you all, is because it turns out your workers, your employees, are a lot like kids in that sense. They need predictability, they need structure, they need to know what's expected of them every day at work, and they need to know that somebody cares about the work that they're doing. That's consideration. Number two, we know that followers are more engaged if their leaders keep their commitments, keep their promises, they have integrity. Right? So integrity builds trust. Trust is the building block of every single relationship. If you don't trust your romantic partner, your relationship is doomed. If you don't trust your business partner, your business is doomed. So we build trust by keeping our commitments, by being honest, by not lying, by not double dealing. Right. So we know that effective leaders create trust because that they have integrity. And at the same time, they also remain steady under pressure. There's lots of research, particularly we saw a lot of this coming out around the COVID situation. There's a lot of research suggesting, hey, when things get really stressful, when times get really tough, the most effective leaders can keep the group calm. Again, think about this from a group. The history of warfare is full of battles where it wasn't really about did we kill more people on the other side. It was about did we make them break? Did we make them give up and run? Because when a group becomes disorganized, they're less effective, right? And so leaders who can remain calm and steady under pressure are more likely to keep the group organized, to keep the group engaged, even when times are stressful. Number three, we know that leaders who display expertise and good judgment also create more engagement in their team members. What do we mean by expertise? Well, expertise means you actually have to understand the business that you're in. If you're a general leading the army, you have to know what combat is like. If you are a business leader running an automobile manufacturing company, you have to know something about automobiles. If you are a leader today running a, a television company like a Disney, or just generally a content creation company like Disney, you have to know something about the artistic process. You have to know what it takes to create entertainment and entertaining content and delivering that content to your audience. If you don't know that, it's really hard to get followers to believe in you. Followers want to know that you actually know what you're talking about because you've been there or you know something about it. If you don't have that, they're less likely to follow. And by good judgment, well, okay, that maybe seems obvious. Well, we want leaders who make good decisions. That's true. But the reality is we know many decisions we will make in the business world are wrong. Most of the time, in the business world and in other worlds as well, we don't have perfect information. We have to make decisions with the best information that we have available, which means that sometimes we're going to make the wrong decision. So what we mean by good judgment is making a reasonable decision given the limited information that you have. And most importantly, being able to correct that from that decision, being able to look at that decision and say, that decision was wrong. I made a mistake. Let's make a change. And more effective leaders have good judgment. And again, this creates engagement and followers because they go, hey, this leader has the humility to change their mind, to say, hey, I was wrong about that. Let's do something different. And finally, we know effective leaders provide an attractive vision for the future. People want to know, where is this company going? What does the future look like for us? If you are our leader, what will things look like several years or even several months down the road? They want to know what that vision is. This creates inspiration. This creates engagement in the staff. So these are the things that effective leaders do. And of course, you can measure these kinds of things with a good personality assessment. So finally, this leads us to the last section that I'm going to talk about today, which is how to create more effective leaders. If we know what we need from our leaders, how can we create leaders who are more effective? So number one is by keeping ineffective leaders out. Now I think this one's a little bit counterintuitive. I think a lot of people think, well, I have to select better leaders. One way to select better leaders is to keep the really bad ones out. Now, how do we get so many bad leaders? We know about 2/3 of managers have historically failed. Why is that the case? And the answer seems to be because most leaders are evaluated by upper management. If you're a middle manager, typically some top leader, some top management person is evaluating you. And if you want to get promoted, you need to please the upper management. That's what's going to get you to advance. We did an analysis some years ago. It was really fascinating. I wish we published more on this. We've only talked about it a few places here and there, but it's a really fascinating study. We looked at 17 different studies in our archive where we had managers and their performance ratings. So these are people who are managers in their organizations. Their supervisors, typically executives, directors, and sometimes even C-suite individuals, were rating their performance. We got over 1,500 of these managers, their performance was rated. And our goal was to build a personality algorithm to predict what is the personality profile of an effective leader. To be an effective manager, what does that personality profile look like? And so we use some fancy statistics and machine learning modeling to build a model for the effective manager, the one that's rated highly by their supervisors. And what we found was that high performers were seen as high on adjustment, which is easy to get along with. They're sort of emotionally under control. Prudent, which means they follow all the rules, and high on interpersonal sensitivity, mean they're very pleasant, that they sort of agree and go along with other people. They were low on power, which is wanting to win, wanting to compete. They were low on leadership, which is wanting to take charge. And they were low on curiosity or innovativeness, what we might call inquisitiveness. Now, when I looked at this, I thought, well, this is no good. This is not what an effective leader looks. This is not what you want in your leader, someone who just says yes to whatever the boss says. But it turns out that's exactly what top management does want. They don't want leaders, they want followers. And so that's who received good performance ratings. So, what's the implication here? The implication is that there are multiple sources of data you can use to evaluate a leader. You can ask their bosses, like we did in those studies. You can ask their peers, the people who are at their level, other kinds of managers, or you can ask their subordinates, the people who report to them, the people on their teams. Our view at Hogan is that only the subordinates have an accurate view of the ability to create engagement. Bosses don't have any idea. We just saw that. Bosses want someone who is going to push their agenda down and not cause them any problems. Peers, well, if you're any good at leading, your peers aren't going to like you because they see you as competition. They see you as competition for the next promotion. And there's a bunch of data. We have 360 data that shows that same thing. Peers tank the ratings of the highest performers because that they see them as competition. They're typically jealous. Again, this goes back to evolutionary history. This is all about that within group competition right there. But subordinates are the one who actually have the ability. They're the one whose life is most directly affected by their boss, and they have the best ability to evaluate someone's ability to create engagement. Am I engaged in my work? If I have a great leader, I'm going to be more engaged in my work, and only the subordinates can tell you, which means that you should evaluate leadership on the basis of what the subordinates say and subordinates say only. Now, Bob Hogan and I think this is very unlikely to happen because the people at the top prefer to maintain control. However, I will say this: an organization that adopts a radically different approach to promotion is much more likely to improve their leadership by eliminating the political nature of bringing leaders to the top and focusing on who's actually building an engaged and high performing team. Okay, so that's one way to select in or at least eliminate ineffective leaders. What about building more effective leaders, particularly from the ones that I've got? So we talked earlier about the HDS. The HDS has these 11 scales that, again, are supported by data from John Benz and the Center for Creative Leadership, predicting the ways that we go wrong, predicting the ways leaders can fail in their roles. We believe, and we have the data to show this, that getting strategic self-awareness, having awareness of our potential derailers is one way to improve. Now, awareness alone isn't enough. You have to do something about it. Just being aware that you have something and not doing anything about it isn't going to help. But that's the first critical step towards improvement. And what that means is that if you have an assessment that captures reputation, that can capture the ways that you're likely to derail or go wrong as a leader or alienate your staff, you can create behavioral strategies to protect yourself against those. I've seen that with some of the most effective leaders that we worked with. Okay, I'm going to wrap up here in a few minutes to make sure we have plenty of time for questions and answers. But I do want to leave you with this rather long quote, and you don't have to read it all now. I'm going to highlight some of the things that I think are really important. But this comes from a book called The Management Myth by Matthew Stewart. And I really like this book. Matthew Stewart was a longtime consultant at a big leadership consulting firm. They did consulting work all over the world with all kinds of really, really big companies. And this is the sort of the lessons that he learned in doing this work. It is really, the book is all about what does it take to be an effective leader? What do we actually know about effective leadership? And much of what we know about effective leadership actually comes from ancient wisdom. Another way of saying this is that if you read Plato's Republic, you can learn pretty much all you need to know about what it means to be an effective leader. So what does Matthew Stewart have to tell us? Well, he says that effective leaders have the facility for analysis and greater talent for synthesis. So that is the ability, this is that expertise and competence that we're talking about. They have the ability to analyze a problem with their expertise, but even better, to take pieces of information from a variety of sources, synthesize that information, and make a good decision. That's that good judgment that we talk about. They have an eye for detail and the one thing that really matters. That is, they have the ability to both be operational, to understand what's happening on the shop floor of the organization, but also see the big picture, provide that vision for the organization as well. They have the ability to reflect on facts in a disinterested way. This is, they're able to remain calm under pressure in some ways. Again, they're able to exercise good judgment because they don't get caught up emotionally in what they want the answer to be. They're happy to look at the facts and make a decision. They're dissatisfied with pat answers and the conventional wisdom. Again, this is the same kind of thing. This is about making good judgment and good decisions. They take pleasure in knowledge itself. We actually saw that a little bit earlier when we looked at learning approach, but we'll talk more about it. We can talk about that in the Q&A if you want. More importantly, they have a wide knowledge of the world and better knowledge of the way people work. This is about building trust. That's part of what EQ is all about, is understanding the organization you're working with. That's what he's talking about here. They have honesty, integrity, and trustworthiness, right? They create respect in others. Again, that's that integrity component we talked about earlier. And ultimately, he says, at the end of the day, a good, effective leader is no more than a good and well-educated person. Or put another way, and I really like this, he says, good managers don't need to be trained. They need to be educated. You need to understand these kinds of things. You need to understand how to create structure. You need to understand how to demonstrate that you care about your employees. You need to understand how to exercise good judgment, how to correct your mistakes. You need to build trust and integrity in others. And all of this is stuff that you could, again, read in ancient books, even children's books talk about these things as core values. That's because that's what it means to be an effective leader. Okay, so let's just talk about some of the key points. One is that we know evolution has created a set of fundamental motives for humans, and those motives shape the way we interact in groups. And that leads to things like groups competing with each other within the group, competing for status, but also competing between each group with each other. And so building coalitions inside groups, getting along, and aiming for status inside groups. These are fundamental motives that all humans have, and that leads to the way we interact with each other today in modern organizations. These shape the way we both emerge, the way we compete with each other within groups, and the way that groups compete with each other, which are really essential leadership processes. Most of the research on leadership, these leadership processes, is focused on emergence, but much more research could focus on effectiveness. And we know a little bit about effectiveness, and that's what we've talked about here, that ultimately effective leaders have the ability to create engagement. They have the ability to get a group to set aside their own individual goals and to work together for the better of the group, for the better of the between group competition. And ultimately, creating effective leadership requires that we change the way we select leaders today. Instead of selecting leaders via some political process, we need to select leaders who are most likely to create engagement. And we need to develop leaders in a way that helps them create more engagement with their staffs. With that, I will say thank you very much.